I'm going to put the page we're going to use in the first link, in the first comment. So if you're watching this, the source sheet for today will be in the first comment. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to do that. Oh, this is very painful. You gotta get used to doing these things. Let me see if I can get it up on the... Just one moment, please. Please bear with me one more moment. I have to create a GIF file out of the source sheet. Just a second. Try this again. Where did it go? This used to be easier. I can't get the source sheet on. I don't know why. Oh well. I guess you'll just have to somehow. I don't even know where to put it so you can even get it. Okay, sorry, I don't know how to get the source sheet up, so we're just gonna have to do it by by listening. Just a moment, let me close the door and I'll be with you. Okay, so if you're still with me, let's start. This is our series of classes on faith and confidence, where faith and confidence are basically two words that in English are mostly seen as synonymous, and even in Hebrew, the Hebrew equivalents, emunah and bitachon, are usually understood by people as being some kind of synonym for one another. But as we've been discussing in this series, this is actually the 49th class, faith and confidence are completely different, and the Torah goes a long way to explain the difference between them. And faith is more about emptying and purging the mind of any kind of machinations, any kind of thoughts that somehow there is anything but God in the world. That's the first prerogative of faith. And that's the faith that Abraham had. And confidence is when we recognize that the fact that we're in this world in the first place is not for pleasure or for any kind of self-indulgence, but rather to fulfill our mission. The soul came down into this world, into a physical body, in order to fulfill a mission. And that mission is up to us to fulfill. In other words, we have to be confident in our ability to do what we've been given as a task, both day to day and in the bigger picture of what life is about. So confidence is about God giving us the jurisdiction, if you will, to act in the world the way that we think we should in order to fulfill our mission. In other words, we have to plan out, we have to think exactly how it is that we're going to get from point A to point B. And that requires confidence. And we've talked a lot about there being passive confidence and active confidence. Passive confidence is when we know what the plan should be, we know what the actions needed are. However, they're not within our power to actually carry out. So when it's not in my power to carry out the steps of the plan, the steps of the process that I think that I need to go through, I have to have passive confidence. Passive confidence is just envisioning what the process would look like. And then the passive part of it is to believe, or to have confidence rather, that God will fill the gaps of what I can't do myself. That's passive confidence. So passive confidence requires a lot of thought, and it's actually what the Lubavitcher Rebbe used to call think good and it will be good. That in places where we can't carry out the process or necessary stages in the process, we have to believe, we have to have confidence that God will fill the gaps for us. Active confidence is in places where we do have the capacity, we have the ability to actually carry us through the different stages. Things that I do with coaching, one of perhaps the first step in building a plan is to divide the different stages under those that I have or the person who's being coached has the ability to carry out, and into those stages and those actions that the person who's being coached can't carry out by himself, that he needs providence from above, he needs support from God to fulfill those stages. The moment that a person is clear on the difference between the two, it becomes much easier to actually go ahead with executing the plan that I've put into place. As long as I either think that everything is up to me, or that nothing is up to me, or that they're just confused and I don't know what's up to me and what's up to, or what's beyond my capacity, it causes tremendous confusion in actually getting to execute the plan that I have in place. So as good as the plan might be, if I don't know what part I have left beyond my reach, beyond my ability, and therefore I leave it to God to take care of that. As long as I don't know what those parts are, I don't know how to pray for them, I don't know what to pray for. So then it becomes very difficult for me to actually execute the plan, because there's so much that is just hanging up in the air and I don't know exactly what the right address for those things is. Should the address be more of my efforts? Should the address be more of God's efforts? I'm not sure. So the first stage in taking apart any plan of action is to separate out what is in my capacity to do and what's not in my capacity to do. Those things that are in my capacity, I should have active confidence about, understanding that God is giving me the strength and the power and the ability to carry these parts out to the best of my ability. Those parts which I can't take care of by myself, they are beyond my capacity. There I have to have passive confidence. I know what the process should be, but it's up to God to take care of those steps, and I have to ask for them. I have to actually, through prayer or any other means, meditation, whatever it is, envision and ask God, as I would ask my Father, these things are beyond my capacity. I need you to take care of them. So that's the difference between passive and active confidence and how we use it in coaching. What we started with last time, we started chapter 6, which I wanted to put the translation of up on the Facebook note, but I haven't been able to, so I'm sorry about that. I'm just going to read the parts that we need today. What we started with in chapter 6 is very relevant and pertinent to this time of year, as we're about a week and a half before Passover, that before Moses was sent to redeem the people from Egypt, God gave him a holy name that he repeated twice. He said, I will be what I will be. Ekia asher ekia. And we explained last time that there are two different ways of understanding why this repetition occurred. Two different reasons for why it occurred. According to the revealed tradition of the Torah, the first ekia was, I'm giving them confidence now to be redeemed from Egypt. And the second instance, the second ekia, was in order to tell them that just as I was with them in this trouble, in the bondage in Egypt, I will be with them in all future suppressions by any nations of the world. That was from the revealed tradition, and that's what Rashi brings on the verse. In the concealed tradition, it's actually almost the opposite. The opposite being that the first ekia, the first instance of this special name of God, I will be, the first instance relates to the crown, which is the far surrounding light, or the far inspiration in a person's life, the far energy in the super conscious part of the soul, the part that's not integrated into the body, the part where you don't experience directly. And that represents faith. And actually the second ekia represents confidence. And what this implies is that in our current state of affairs, where we are now in history, that we're just before the final redemption, what's needed is to strengthen ourselves with confidence, with security, with trust in our ability to bring about the final redemption, meaning that the faith that we've had for 2,000 years that the redemption will come has to be taken into the background. And that faith has to be used from the background to energize our feeling that it's now up to us, that we are capable of bringing about the final redemption. I want to say something about our current situation, even though I almost promised myself that I wouldn't, but it's a little difficult not to talk about it. There's all kinds of, we also in previous class talked about a lot about what the pandemic of coronavirus does to all the systems of order. But we didn't say anything positive in the sense of something constructive. Meaning, what needs to be constructed at this time? What kind of actions does the world both need? Even if I wouldn't be a Jew and I wouldn't understand faith in God, even if I had none of these at my side, the one thing that I would probably come up with is that a pandemic, by its very nature, requires international cooperation, global cooperation to solve. You can't solve it the way things have been solved in the past. In other words, there's not one nation in the world that can solve this by itself. There has to be a lot of cooperation. And in the same way that cooperation actually made it possible for this pandemic to become what it has become so quickly, to spread around the world so quickly, because we have what we call a global economy, and because we're all dependent on one another, you could say that the pandemic comes and tells us or sends us a message that the cooperation has to go a level higher. And level higher means that it's incorrect to see each nation as standing separate from others, in the sense that it's okay to have competition, but you can't have rivalry. They're not the same thing. Competition is what you do in a sports event. Rivalry is what you do in a street fight. That's not the same thing. And competition would mean that each nation or each group of people has to be strong in whatever it does and has to want to get ahead. Rivalry means that I won't cooperate with you, thinking that somehow if I cooperate with you, I'll be left behind. That's incorrect. And one of the things that has been impressed upon us by the sages, and the Rebbe talked about this many times, is that the times of Mashiach are actually a time when, like the prophet Isaiah says, the nations will set aside their rivalries. One way of saying that is that you take your weapons of destruction and you turn them into weapons or into tools of cooperation, tools of productivity. So what's needed now is the spirit of Mashiach, which is Mashiach himself, if you think about it, to bring about a cooperation to solve the pandemic. The reason this requires global cooperation is because everybody who thinks about this for 5 minutes will figure out that you can't suppress the virus just in one country. You have to suppress it around the world at the same time. So you either go the one path, which is just let it burn itself out without cooperation, without anything. It's just going to take a huge death toll. But if you're already sacrificing your economies for a small amount of time in order to save more lives, it should be a global effort that would wipe out the pandemic in one shot and not let it continue to spread from one country to the other, which is what will happen invariably if it's not a global effort. In other words, one country can wipe it out. China might think it's finished, but 2 days later, when they open their borders and people come from Europe, they'll bring it right back. And you can use a lot of quarantine methods to try to prevent that. But those quarantine methods themselves would be much, much better served if everybody was cooperating globally in order to wipe it out at the same time and not just wait. The effort has to be global. It's true that so let's leave it at that. So getting back to what we need in our times today, I want to focus on this idea of confidence and how it affects the way that your relationship with God goes. We've talked about this in the past, but we haven't really gotten down into the nitty-gritty of the psychological effects of confidence. And again, confidence says that overall, it's my duty, it's my mission to bring about change. And it's not going to happen because God does things. That's faith. Faith says there's nothing by God, therefore it's His responsibility, it's not mine. Confidence, which is a novel idea that was introduced into the world by Abraham, says that I was put into this world as an emissary of God in order to bring about change. And that it's up to me, and it's not up to God. So let's see something that, again, I translated on the source sheet. I'll just have to read to you since I wasn't able to put it up. The revealed confidence we had during the time we left Egypt. What was the revealed confidence? The revealed confidence at that time of the Exodus was the feeling, the joy that comes from doing a commandment. That was the revealed confidence. That's why before they left Egypt, the Torah says that Moses was commanded to give the people a number of commandments, a number of mitzvot. Mitzvot means that Hashem is entrusting me, God is entrusting me with changing reality, because that's the difference between a commandment and just something else that I do. A commandment has the power to sanctify a piece of mundane reality. In this case, the very first commandment that they received was to sanctify the new moon, meaning to sanctify time. Before this commandment was given, HaChodesh hazeh lachem Rosh Chodashim, this month for you is the first of months. We're talking about the month of Nisan, which just began 4 days ago. Today we're in the 5th of Nisan. 4 days ago, last week on Thursday. They received that commandment as the very first commandment in the Torah. Before then, whatever the patriarchs had done, they did out of volunteerism. They weren't commanded to do it. And the drawback with that is that when you volunteer, when you do things out of your own goodwill, they have a lot of meaning for you, but they don't necessarily change reality. What changes reality, what gives the power to change reality, is that God commands and man follows the commandment. And therefore, it has an ability, a commandment has the ability to change reality, to sanctify reality, not just to sanctify myself. So the first commandment was to sanctify the new moon, the new moon of Nisan, the first month. In the Torah, the name is obviously not Nisan, because these names are Babylonian names that came later. In the Torah, it's just called the first month. Sanctifying the new moon of the first month as the first commandment was to change time, to give time sanctity. As we know, the Jewish calendar in its pristine form is defined by the date on which each month starts. Especially this is true regarding Passover. How do you know when the 15th of the first month, the 15th of Nisan is? Well, it depends on what day the new moon was sanctified. Sanctified meaning it was defined as the first day of the month. And since God entrusted the Jewish people with the ability, with the commandment to sanctify the new moon every month, time is sanctified, the holidays, the holy days are sanctified based on our decision. This, as we passed, is the strongest example of what it means that God entrusts man with the ability to sanctify the world. And this is what confidence stems from. The understanding that there's a relationship between me and God, and it's not just a one-way relationship where I ask for something that I need, but rather that God has entrusted me with a mission in order to change reality. That's what confidence stems from that relationship. All the commandments begin with an understanding of this relationship. In other words, I would not be commanded for God's benefit, but rather for my own, meaning this is what gives meaning to my life. The fact that I have a purpose, the fact that I have a mission is what gives meaning to life. In that sense, every single commandment that God gave is an expression of His love for humanity, for the Jewish people. And beginning, it's for the Jewish people. When the Jewish people merit to explain this to the rest of the world, then the rest of the world can take on the commandments that it was entrusted with, because God also loved Noah, and He also gave him commandments. In parentheses, I have to add, because it's impossible not to add this, and should be a shot that's heard around the world, that the present pandemic that we're in the middle of was caused by people disregarding one of the 7 Noahide commandments. What is one of them? It's not eating a living animal. And we know that these viruses make the jump because animals are eaten alive, specifically in China, but it happens in other places in the world. But it happens there much more because there's a larger percentage of people who do this, not even for the nutritional value. They do it for some vague belief in some remedial qualities that certain animals have. First of all, it's very cruel the way that they do this. If you go out and read about what they did at Pangolian, the little animal that they, whose fetuses they eat alive. But it's a direct transgression of the very simple, universal commandment not to eat flesh from a living animal. And everything that we're suffering through right now, and the loss of life, and the loss of material wealth, and so on, and the anxiety, and everything that goes with that, was all started by the simple fact that somebody decided that they had to eat this animal alive. So it's important to understand that the commandments, beyond being a source of meaning, they have that meaning because they express God's love for me. Because of His love for me, He's commanded me to have meaning in life and to have dominion in life. And dominion means that I have a part of reality to rectify, to sanctify. That in turn creates confidence. In the same way that the relationship between parents and the children is that I give especially around this time of year when there's a lot to do around the house, I need to give my children duties and chores and whatever you want to call it, not out of a sense that they have to fulfill my will, but because I love them. Loving them means giving them duties, giving them a chance to fulfill themselves, to be able to carry out tasks on their own. Love means that I care for you enough to try to make you independent. So the truth is that I could clean the entire house in one day anyway. The fact that I give some of these duties to my children is because I want to make them a partner with me in this, and to show them that they can handle tasks, that they can take them from beginning to end. That's why it's so important when a child finishes a task to not criticize it, because the criticism is understood by the child as failure. On the other hand, we're also against giving too much praise, because that creates satisfaction from the praise. Rather, the correct response, the correct reaction to a child finishing a task is how wonderful that you were able to finish this, without giving them a grade on how good or not good it was, but rather how good it is and how wonderful and how empowering it is to you that you were able to take a task and complete it. And again, the quality of how well the task was performed is really not relevant. In the same way, when God gives us commandments, He's actually making us a partner, and He's trying in sanctifying reality, which He could do by Himself anyway. And by making us a partner, He's expressing His love for us because He wants to make us independent. He wants us to be able to take responsibility for our lives, for what we can take responsibility for. Obviously, we're not going to tell a 10-year-old, go and cook the entire meal from beginning to end, because that's not something they can do. But what they are capable of doing, you give them the responsibility of doing. And the same thing is that God gives us part of reality to take care of. He doesn't force us. He doesn't command us to ensure that the sun continues to burn. He doesn't tell us to take responsibility for the earth spinning on its axis, or for the entire universe spinning on its axis, or whatever it is. That He takes care of Himself. But in the areas in which man was destined to become independent, there He gives us commandments. And so the commandments are an expression of love. And the more a person feels that the commandments are an expression of love, the more that he feels that God loves him, the more he can have confidence in his ability to perform that task to the best of his ability. So that's a very important relationship between confidence and love. But there's also an opposite relationship, which actually leads to the opposite result. There are people who perform commandments out of fear of retribution. In other words, they look at the commandments not as an opportunity to become a partner, to have meaning in life, but rather they look at it as some kind of demand, which might even be completely sporadic and without meaning, arbitrary. God just made up His mind about, whatever nonsense He wants you to do, just to see if you'll do it. And they treat the commandments as if there's some test to see whether they'll do them or not. Now, it's not that approach doesn't exist, because the sages also say that God could have created the world with a different set of commandments. He could have. Meaning, at some level, they are arbitrary. God could have decided that instead of putting tefillin on every day, we would need to, wrap something around our neck. Or He could have decided, instead of wrapping it, maybe it's wearing something on your nose, or anything like that, like the masks that people walk around. That could have been part of it. So the world could have been created in a different way, but you have to understand that the moment that the commandments were decided upon, the world was created to fit those commandments. Meaning that the commandments, as they came down to us, they defined what type of world this would be. Again, God has the freedom to create a different type of world where the commandments would have been something else. In that sense, they're arbitrary. But given the world in the state that it is now, they aren't arbitrary. They're the best vehicle for creating a shared responsibility for reality and, in the long run, independence, an ability of man to act with confidence that he can complete tasks, that he can transform the world, that he can make it into something more. So in that sense, the commandments are like God's coaching method for, at first, the Jewish people, and then for the rest of humanity eventually. But if you look at the commandments, like we just said, that there's some kind of test, and that you're constantly being just tested arbitrarily to see whether you're going to do something or not, and you get, demerit points if you don't do it right. So that's destructive to the sense that God loves us and that he gives the commandments for our benefit. It becomes like, well, I'm just under a magnifying glass all the time, and my feeling is of somebody who's being hounded. And that leads to a sense of sterility and an inability to act in reality. It becomes that the commandments are like some kind of defensive act that you do in order to save yourself from punishment. And they're not used in the right way. They're not done in the right way, or at least they're done in a way that becomes destructive to your ability to act confidently, your ability to act independently in reality. The epitome of this type of thinking was, maybe not surprisingly, and it's actually very fitting when you think about it, was written about by Moses himself. The sages say that Moses wrote 3 things in his life. We know the first thing, that's the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses. Genesis through Deuteronomy. And that's the Torah. The sages also say that he wrote the prophecies of Balaam, Bilam as we say in Hebrew. Those prophecies were given directly to Bilam, and Moshe Rabbeinu heard them however he heard them, and he included them in Parshat Balak, in a part of the book of Numbers. The third book that he wrote is very surprising to many people because it's not well known, is the book of Job. What is the book of Job about? And now we're coming to the crux of what it means that the commandments are meant to strengthen your confidence. The book of Job tells the story of a man who is described as God-fearing. He's very God-fearing. In fact, he's so God-fearing, I recommend reading the first chapter of Job. You know what? As a matter of fact, I should have brought it here before. I'm going to bring a translation and read with you the first chapter just to see the background of where Job was coming from in his approach to his relationship with God. Just a moment. So let's just read the very beginning of Job, which describes the background of this very intense book. It says like this: there was a man in the land of Uz, whose name was Job. In Hebrew, you say Eov, and we'll get to that in a moment. That man was wholesome and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. 7 sons and 3 daughters were born to him. His possessions consisted of 7,000 sheep and goats, 3,000 camels, 500 pairs of cattle, 500 she-donkeys, and very many enterprises. That man was the wealthiest man of all the people in the East. So we have here a very successful individual who is very God-fearing. Now, Moses is going to tell us what kind of actions that fear of God led him to. He says like this: his sons would go and make a feast at each one's home, each on his set day. He had 7 sons, so every day of the week there was a feast that one of the sons made. And they would send word and invite their sisters, their 3 sisters, to eat and drink with them. When each cycle of feast days had ended, at the end of each week, Job would send to summon them. He would rise early in the morning and bring as many burnt offerings as the number of them all. So he brought what we call olot. Olot means a burnt offering that's completely consumed by the fire. Why did he do this? Why did he bring 10 burnt offerings at the end of each week, at the end of each feast cycle? He did this for Job said to himself, perhaps my children have sinned and blasphemed Hashem, God, in their hearts. Thus would Job do all the days. This was his tradition. This was his habit. What do we have here? We have a very successful man who constantly is in fear of losing everything because of sin. When he brings the burnt offerings, it's not out of a feeling of gratitude to God for everything that he's been given. It's out of a sense of fear of heaven, fear of punishment. And the fear of punishment is not just his own. It's regarding his children. It extends beyond himself. It becomes what we call compulsive. It becomes something that takes over his life. The sages say something incredible. They say his name in Hebrew, we said, is Eov. And they say psychologically, again, what was in his mind? They say that he said to God, perhaps the one who loves you has been exchanged by mistake with one who is your enemy. What are they trying to say? They're trying to say, they're telling us that in Job's mind, he thought he was loving God, when that God was perhaps loving him. But in reality, it was like there were enemies who were keeping a very delicate truce, a very delicate peace between them. So that his fear of God actually brought upon him the wrath. And this is a verse that he says later on in chapter 3. At the end of the very last verse of chapter 3, it says, he suddenly realizes, because I feared a fright, and it has overtaken me, what I dreaded has come upon me. The fear of God that he had brought upon him the exact calamity he was afraid of. And he continues, I was not secure, I was not quiet, I was not at rest, and therefore torment has come. at the end of chapter 3, he begins to understand the very important principle taught by the Baal Shem Tov, that God is like your shadow on your right hand. In other words, God acts with you the way you act with him. So if I feel, like Job did, that I'm constantly under a magnifying glass, being scrutinized for the smallest transgression, because God is vindictive and only looking to hurt me. So that's exactly what I draw down from above. And more importantly, it makes me incapable of acting independently. It makes me dependent, constantly dependent. So it's not that that feeling is entirely wrong. It's just that that's not what's required from us in this time, in this age, when our duty is to bring about the redemption. It's to act in a way that God considers transferring the burden to us and telling us, Ekia now, I will be is now up to you. What I will be, what God will be in the world now depends on our actions. Because as we said, in the first redemption from Egypt, it was about passive confidence and about faith. And in this redemption, the final redemption, it's about transforming the faith of 2,000 years that the redemption would come into action, into a state of security and confidence that God has given us the power to bring about with our actions the redemption. So let's get back to Job again. When the outlook is one of faith, we talked about this in previous classes, it's usually related, faith is usually related to fear of heaven. There is a very positive idea of fear of heaven. It's not that you shouldn't fear heaven, but fear of heaven really needs to be transformed, or the test of whether it's true fear of heaven and not just fear of punishment, fear of transgression in the sense of being inept and unable to act, is whether you're sensitive to other people. That's the real test about whether you really fear heaven. To fear heaven, God says, first of all, when it comes to transgressions against me, I'm willing, says God, to forgive everything. But I can't forgive transgressions against other people. So the real test about whether we have a true sense of fear of heaven is how we act towards other people. And therefore we a lot of times say that fear of heaven in our generation translates into sensitivity to other people. But again, even when you're sensitive means not hurting somebody. So sensitivity also means inaction. We talked a little bit about this 2 weeks ago regarding the current pandemic, that sensitivity to another person can also mean not touching them, because it's a sensitivity to the holiness of another person's personhood, to their body, to the fact that the body is also a reflection of God's infinite light. In fact, the body is more a reflection of the infinite light than even the soul. So that sensitivity causes a pulling away. That's the source of the commandments that are prohibitive, not to do something. But here we're working on the opposite sense of the relationship with God, which is the essence of Abraham's relationship with God, which is loving kindness, which is to understand that God loves me, and because he loves me, he gave me the commandments in order to empower me, in order to give me responsibility for part of reality. And therefore the commandments, what I do, not the prohibitive ones, but actually the active ones, the prescriptive ones, they are a manifestation of that love. And they lead to my independence in making me able to take responsibility for my life, for the part of reality that I need to take care of. I don't have a clock here, so if somebody can tell me what time it is, it'll help a lot. If somebody can just write it in the comments, so I know when to end. What I want to do now is read all of this in a manuscript that we have from Reb Hillel of Parich. Reb Hillel of Parich was one of the greatest thinkers in Chabad, and some of his writings have not been published yet. This is from a manuscript that we have from him. So he writes like this: when a person acts and conducts himself with confidence, it's 1:30 right now. Okay, so I'll end in a couple of minutes. When a person acts and conducts himself with confidence, that person draws down from above love and loving kindness from God. As it says, there's a verse in Psalms, he who trusts in God will be surrounded by loving kindness. Confidence itself depends specifically on love, just as one trusts a friend that loves him, and one is confident that that friend will provide for him. Okay, I'll end now. However, if a person acts and conducts himself with unwarranted suspicion and fear, conducting himself according to a measure of judgment, he feels that God is always judging him, he mimics the conduct of Job. Job was God-fearing and constantly feared the possibility that perhaps my sons have sinned. By doing so, he drew down upon himself a measure of judgment from above. As he says, I was not secure, I was not quiet, I was not at rest, and torment has come. The torment came because of his lack of serenity, which is why the Baal Shem Tov taught that God is like your shadow on your right hand. The way that you see the relationship between yourself and the Almighty, if you see it as God expressing his love for you and therefore giving you the commandments, therefore giving you the strength to do good in the world, then what comes to you is a measure of loving kindness and love from above. I can't say how important this is for times like this, that a person should not walk around with fear and suspicion. A person should be serene and quiet and secure, knowing that whatever I can do, I will do, and that everything that God is doing, he's doing for me, in order to empower me, in order to make me more independent. But, as we said, sometimes, in order to become more independent, like we're seeing right now, it's not just our independence as individuals, but independence as communities, as nations, and even the entire world together. Meaning that to get out of this, we won't be able to get out of this without real cooperation between everybody. Meaning it's taking our health in our own hands and understanding that we have the capability to get rid of this virus. But it will take cooperation. It won't be done just by each nation separately. It will eventually, because every virus in the end ends. Nobody needs to actually eradicate it. None of the viruses that were in the past lived more than a year or two. We don't know why exactly. We have all kinds of theories. But, again, at the personal level, I have to always see everything out of a state of serenity, out of a state that God is empowering me to do what I can. The relationship always has to be founded upon love, like Abraham's love for God and feeling that God loves him, because they mimic one another, they mirror one another. The more I feel that everything I'm doing is because God has empowered and entrusted me, he trusts in me, he loves me in order to give me the possibility to do. Yes, I know that the live markets in China are open, and I spoke about that, and it's one of the things that if there is something that comes out of all of this, is a call to everybody to fulfill that commandment of the Noahide laws, not to eat a living animal, then that itself is already a sign of Mashiach. That itself is a sign of redemption, that the entire world is ready to hear the wisdom of the Torah. And here it's not even wisdom, it's not even written in the Torah openly. It doesn't even say it literally. This is how the sages interpreted how they understood the Torah. So it's to understand the wisdom of how the sages understood Torah. So in any case, we'll end here. And God willing, if there is time next week, and we're not all too hectic with Passover preparations, we'll try to have maybe another class next week. And until then, I hope everybody is well and doing well. And I'll see you then. All the best.